Chapter 1. Judge Boasberg, a troublemaker and agitator, is obstructing justice. The Truth social post was a Molotov cocktail thrown into an already raging fire, the words blazing across screens with the force of a battle cry, igniting a new phase in an already volatile conflict between Trump and the judiciary. Judge Boasberg, a troublemaker and agitator, is obstructing justice. It screamed, the capital letters punching through the screen with the kind of aggressive certainty that Trump had mastered, his unfiltered fury laid bare for millions to see. Below, in smaller but no less pointed font, the familiar refrain followed like a drumbeat to his cause. Obama appointee, unelected, doesn't have the authority. The post spread like wildfire, conservative media amplifying it, supporters rallying around it, the opposition reacting with outrage, and just like that, another front in Trump's war against the deep state had been opened. For Judge James Boasberg, it was just another Tuesday, just another moment in the relentless tide of political warfare that had engulfed the judiciary since Trump had entered the political arena. He had seen worse, heard worse, ruled on worse, but this time, the pressure felt different, heavier, more immediate. His decision to ground the flights carrying Venezuelan migrants back to Venezuela, deeming their expedited deportations unlawful, had ignited a firestorm of controversy, a ruling that had instantly positioned him as the latest obstacle in Trump's crackdown on illegal immigration. To Boasberg, he was upholding the law, ensuring that due process wasn't discarded in the face of political expediency. But to Trump, this wasn't just a ruling, it was a betrayal, an affront, an open act of defiance by an unelected bureaucrat who was placing his own interpretation of the law above the will of the people and the president they had elected to enforce it. As the day wore on, the backlash grew louder. Cable news was saturated with pundits debating the implications, with right-wing commentators hammering home the narrative that the courts were actively obstructing national security. Later that evening, Trump doubled down on the Ingraham angle, Fox News' primetime megaphone for his grievances, where his presence was less of an interview and more of a rallying cry. His face, illuminated by the studio lights, carried the familiar look of righteous indignation, the expression of a man who thrived on the fight, who had never backed down from a battle and wasn't about to start now. "This judge is playing politics," he boomed, his voice rising with the certainty of a man who knew exactly how to channel his outrage into political momentum. "He's siding with the radical left, endangering our country. This is why we need to take action. We need strong leadership, not activist judges standing in the way of securing our borders." The crowd watching at home didn't need to be convinced. They had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Trump to put into words what they had already been shouting at their screens, at their dinner tables, at town hall meetings across the country. As Trump spoke, the reality of what was unfolding became clearer. This wasn't just about a single ruling, or one judge, or even the deportation flights. This was about power, about control, about the fundamental question of who really ruled America, the elected president chosen by the people, or the judiciary that often seemed to operate above them, insulated from consequence. And Trump, sensing the moment, knowing the stakes, knew exactly how to play it. The battle had begun. Chapter 2. Deputy White House Chief of Staff. The next morning, the West Wing buzzed with a frenetic energy, the air thick with urgency, the kind that only came when Washington's power brokers sensed a battle brewing. In the Oval Office, Trump held court, his presence dominating the room, his voice commanding, his signature red tie slightly askew from the sheer force of his gestures as he outlined his next move. This wasn't just about immigration policy anymore. This was about power, about control, about who truly ran the country, the elected president or an unelected judiciary bent on obstructing him at every turn. Seated in front of him was Stephen Miller, his deputy White House Chief of Staff, a man who had spent years crafting and defending Trump's hawkish immigration policies, only to have them repeatedly challenged, blocked, and delayed by activist judges. He stood rigid, his eyes gleaming with zeal, the familiar fire of ideological warfare burning bright. Next to him, Pam Bondi, now Attorney General, a loyalist through and through, paced the length of the room, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor, a rhythmic reminder of her agitation, her readiness to strike back. She had spent her career taking down corrupt bureaucrats and politicians. She wasn't about to let a federal judge derail the president's vision without a fight. And then there was Mike Johnson, the newly elected Speaker of the House, a man whose position was still precarious, who held power but not yet unshakable loyalty, and whose every move was being scrutinized by both allies and enemies alike. He sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his brow furrowed, knowing that whatever decision was made in this room today would set the course for the next great political battle of Trump's presidency. Trump didn't wait for discussion. "We need to impeach him," he declared, slamming his fist on the resolute desk, the sharp sound reverberating through the room, punctuating the absolute conviction in his voice. "Boasberg is abusing his power. He's defying the will of the American people." The room held its breath for half a second, not in shock, not in uncertainty, but in the realization that Trump had just drawn the battle lines. The entire weight of the presidency, of Congress, of Trump's political machine, was about to descend upon Judge James Boasberg. Stephen Miller was ready. Ever the strategist, ever the architect of policy battles, he stepped forward with a meticulously prepared dossier, his hands steady, his mind already racing ahead to how this would play out in the press, in Congress, in the courts, in the very heart of the American public. He placed it on the desk, flipping it open, pointing to sections highlighted in red, the legal case against Boasberg laid out in precise, devastating clarity. "Mr. President, we've compiled a comprehensive case," Miller began, his tone confident, controlled, unwavering. "The articles of impeachment will focus on abuse of power and obstruction of justice." He flipped to a specific section, highlighting key rulings where Boasberg had ruled against the administration, each decision framed as an act of deliberate judicial overreach, a rogue judge actively undermining the president's agenda, twisting the law to fit a political agenda rather than enforcing it fairly. Trump nodded, satisfied. This was not a shot in the dark. This was the opening salvo in a battle that would define the next chapter of his presidency. This was war. Chapter 3. Loyalty to Trump was the bedrock of his political career. Bondi nodded in agreement, her mind already calculating the legal avenues, the messaging strategy, the precise wording that would make this more than just a political strike. It would be a case built on national security, on judicial overreach, on the fundamental question of whether an unelected judge had the right to defy the will of the American people. "We can argue that his rulings are politically motivated, exceeding his judicial authority," she said, her voice measured, authoritative, filled with the certainty of a prosecutor who had built her career dismantling corrupt institutions and exposing abuse of power. "We can also emphasize the security risks associated with allowing these migrants to remain in the country. We have enough data, enough intelligence reports to make the case that his ruling is actively endangering American citizens. This isn't just obstruction, this is negligence." Across the room, Mike Johnson sat stiffly, his hands still clasped tightly in his lap, his face tense, knowing that he was standing on the precipice of a decision that could define his career, for better or worse. He was not a man who relished conflict, nor was he someone who wanted to be the target of the media's next firestorm. His voice was subdued, cautious, a careful balance between deference and hesitation. "Mr. President," he began, his words slow, deliberate, "impeaching a judge is a serious matter. We need to be absolutely certain we have the grounds to do so. This could be seen as an attack on the independence of the judiciary." The room fell silent for a brief but heavy moment, the air thick with expectation, and then Trump fixed him with a steely gaze, his expression unreadable yet filled with the weight of command, of a leader who had long since lost patience for those who hesitated in the face of action. He leaned forward slightly, his hands pressed firmly against the desk, his voice lower now, but no less powerful. "Mike, the American people elected me to protect this country. This judge is a threat. Are you with me or are you with him?" The question was not a request, it was a challenge. Johnson swallowed hard, his throat dry, his mind racing through the possibilities, the consequences, the undeniable truth that there was no middle ground here. Loyalty to Trump was the bedrock of his political career. Without it, he had nothing. He had seen what happened to those who wavered, who hesitated, who thought they could ride the line between loyalty and self-preservation. There was no room for doubt, no space for hesitation. He straightened his shoulders, met Trump's gaze, and nodded, his voice firm, final, resigned to the war that was about to begin. "I'm with you, Mr. President." Chapter 4. Miller's team leaked carefully selected information. The wheels of impeachment began to grind, a well-oiled machine fueled by political momentum, public outrage, and a carefully orchestrated media campaign. Stephen Miller's team, masters of narrative manipulation, wasted no time in leaking carefully selected information to sympathetic media outlets, framing Judge James Boasberg as an out-of-touch elitist, a rogue jurist actively obstructing the president's efforts to secure the border and protect American citizens. Headlines screamed with words designed to inflame, to outrage, to mobilize. Activist judge blocks Trump's border security, again. And who is James Boasberg, the unelected bureaucrat standing in the way of national security? The storylines were methodical, deliberate, highlighting Boasberg's judicial history, his past rulings, his appointment under Obama, each detail twisted into a larger narrative of a deep state operator working against the will of the people. The public response was immediate and visceral. Trump's base, already primed for battle, erupted in fury, their anger spilling onto social media, talk radio, town halls, and eventually the streets. Rallies ignited across the country, fueled by Trump's fiery rhetoric, his ability to turn the impeachment into a cause, a movement, a referendum not just on Boasberg, but on the very institutions that had long opposed him. In rally after rally, his voice thundered over packed stadiums, the energy crackling like a live wire. This judge, this so-called judge, is blocking your president from protecting you, from securing our borders, from doing what you elected me to do. We don't let unelected bureaucrats run this country. We don't let the deep state win. We fight back. The crowds roared in approval, chants of "Impeach Boasberg!" rolling through the night like a battle cry, thousands of voices unified in purpose, in anger, in the certainty that Trump was the only man willing to take on a system designed to defeat him. Meanwhile, inside the courthouse, Boasberg remained steadfast, a man surrounded by chaos, yet unmoved by it. He ignored the threats, the vitriol, the incessant media scrutiny that followed his every move, the cameras stationed outside his home, the hate mail, the anonymous phone calls warning him of what was to come. He had expected this. He had known the moment he issued his ruling that he would be at the center of a political hurricane, and yet he did not waver. He focused on the law, on the principles of justice he had sworn to uphold, on the belief that the judiciary, no matter how embattled, had to remain above politics, above pressure, above the forces that sought to bend it to their will. He knew he was a target, but he refused to be intimidated. And as the battle lines hardened, as the fight escalated beyond politics and into the very fabric of American governance, one thing was becoming undeniably clear. This wasn't just a battle over one judge's ruling. This was a war for the soul of the country, for the power to define who truly held authority, who shaped the future, who ruled, and neither side was backing down. Chapter 5. Johnson, increasingly uneasy with the direction of the proceedings. As the impeachment proceedings gained momentum, what had initially seemed like an unstoppable force began to show signs of strain, the once unified front within Trump's camp, now fracturing under the weight of political reality. The strategy had been clear from the outset. Turn Boasberg into the embodiment of judicial overreach, a deep state obstructionist actively working against the will of the people. But as the weeks dragged on, as the legal justifications were scrutinized, as the media landscape shifted from outrage to cautious skepticism, cracks began to appear in the president's solid wall of support. Speaker Mike Johnson, initially a key ally in pushing the impeachment forward, began to feel the mounting pressure from within his own caucus. The further the process advanced, the more uneasy he became, not just about the optics, but about the actual legal foundation of the case itself. Behind closed doors, in hushed conversations with moderate Republicans, he expressed his growing concerns, highlighting the lack of concrete evidence against Boasberg beyond his perceived ideological opposition to Trump's agenda. The hardliners dismissed his concerns, arguing that the process itself was just as important as the result, that whether they won or lost, the fight was necessary to prove that no unelected judge could openly defy the will of the administration without consequence. But Johnson wasn't convinced. He had seen what happened to overzealous impeachment attempts. He had watched as political careers imploded under the weight of failed efforts to remove entrenched officials. If this didn't succeed, if the case against Boasberg collapsed under legal scrutiny, it wouldn't be just a minor setback. It would be a disaster, a catastrophic blow to the administration's credibility at a time when they needed unity the most. And he wasn't the only one who saw it. Attorney General Pam Bondi, once one of the most aggressive defenders of the impeachment push, began to distance herself from Miller's more extreme strategies, her legal instincts warning her that they were treading dangerously close to a political miscalculation. She had always been a fighter, always been willing to take the battle to the enemy, but she also knew when a fight was turning unwinnable. The whispers in Washington were growing louder, the concerns from within the GOP more difficult to ignore. She recognized that a failed impeachment attempt wouldn't just be a setback. It could be the kind of defeat that realigned power dynamics within the party, the kind of misstep that could weaken the administration at a crucial moment. And so, as the hearings approached, as Boasberg's legal team prepared their counteroffensive, as the press dug deeper into the legitimacy of the charges, the political winds began to shift. What had once seemed like a bold, calculated move to assert executive power was now starting to look like a risky overreach, a battle that could potentially backfire, leaving Trump with more bruises than victories. The question was no longer just whether they could impeach Boasberg, it was whether they should. And as doubt seeped into the ranks, as alliances frayed, as Bondi and Johnson hesitated while Miller and the hardliners pushed forward, the administration found itself at a crossroads, teetering on the edge of one of the most consequential decisions of Trump's second term. Chapter 6: Stephen Miller, ever the mastermind behind Trump's most aggressive policy battles. The turning point came during the House Judiciary Committee hearings, a moment that should have been the crescendo of months of planning, media blitzes, and political maneuvering, but instead became the unraveling of an effort that had once seemed inevitable. Stephen Miller, ever the mastermind behind Trump's most aggressive policy battles, entered the hearing room with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. His narrative was polished, his strategy meticulous, the evidence carefully curated to paint Judge Boasberg as a rogue judicial activist bent on obstructing the president's authority. At first, Miller's performance was strong, bolstered by Republican committee members eager to frame the impeachment as a necessary check on an overreaching judiciary. He spoke of Boasberg's past rulings, his history of blocking conservative policies, his so-called activist leanings. He described a pattern of behavior that, in Miller's telling, wasn't just judicial interpretation but outright defiance of executive power. He laid out a timeline of decisions that had hindered Trump's agenda, attempting to weave together a narrative of obstruction, bias, and overreach. But then came the cross-examination. Under rigorous questioning from Democratic representatives, the foundation of Miller's case began to crumble. They pressed him on specifics, demanding to know how exactly Boasberg's rulings differed from established precedent, what specific laws he had violated, what clear misconduct could justify impeachment. Miller, who had anticipated political attacks, was ready for the expected rebuttals. But what he wasn't ready for was how quickly his carefully constructed narrative began to unravel under the sheer weight of facts, logic, and a determined opposition that had done its homework. Key pieces of evidence were exposed as circumstantial. What had seemed like a pattern of bias was shown to be consistent with long-standing judicial precedent. Miller's claims of Boasberg's alleged political motivations turned out to be more speculation than evidence, a series of assumptions without a smoking gun. His most damning accusations were met with counterexamples, instances where Boasberg had ruled against Democratic administrations, proving that his judicial record was more balanced than Miller wanted to admit. And then, the bombshell. A surprise witness was called to testify, a former Justice Department official whose name had not appeared in any pre-hearing leaks, whose presence was not anticipated by the administration's legal team, and whose testimony would become the dagger that finally punctured the impeachment effort's momentum. With calm precision, the witness detailed conversations he had had with Miller, conversations that suggested that Miller hadn't just wanted a case against Boasberg, he had been determined to create one. He testified, under oath, that Miller had pressured him to find dirt on Boasberg, to scour his past, to look into his personal and financial history for anything that could be used as ammunition. And then, the final blow, he stated that Miller had even suggested illegal surveillance, implying that if the evidence didn't exist, it could be fabricated, or at the very least, coaxed into existence through methods that were beyond the boundaries of legality. The hearing room fell silent, the air thick with shock as the implications sank in. What had begun as a strong case against a judge was now looking like a political hit job, an attempt to weaponize the impeachment process for retribution rather than justice. The fallout was immediate. The impeachment effort faltered, The Republican representatives who had initially rallied behind the cause now hesitated, some outright withdrawing their support. One by one, members of the House Judiciary Committee, who had been vocal in their push for Boasberg's removal, began backtracking, citing concerns about the integrity of the process, about whether this was truly a case of judicial misconduct or a political overreach that could set a dangerous precedent. Speaker Mike Johnson, who had already been privately uneasy, finally saw his opening to step back from what had started to look like a doomed endeavor. The moment the tide turned, the moment the Republican support fractured beyond repair, he made his decision. In a hastily arranged press conference, surrounded by top Republican leadership, Johnson stepped forward, his expression serious, his tone measured, as he announced what had by now become inevitable. After careful consideration, and in light of recent developments, I will not be bringing the articles of impeachment against Judge James Boasberg to a vote. And with that, the impeachment effort was dead. The Trump administration, once so confident in its ability to bulldoze its opposition, was now left to deal with the fallout of a failed offensive, a rare miscalculation in their otherwise finely tuned war against the establishment. And as the dust settled, one thing was clear: Boasberg had survived, and Trump's enemies had found a new opening to strike back. Chapter 7. The walls of the West Wing shook. Trump was furious. The walls of the West Wing shook with his booming outrage, his voice thundering down the corridors as he lashed out at Johnson, at Bondi, at Miller, at anyone who dared to question his authority. He had pushed them to fight, to make Boasberg a symbol of deep state corruption, and now, at the moment of truth, they had backed Johnson. Gain, folded under pressure, let the establishment win yet again. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years proving that when he went to war, he didn't lose. He had rallied his base, whipped up his supporters, made it clear that this wasn't just about one judge. It was about the larger battle against the forces that had worked tirelessly to undermine his presidency from day one. And now, with one press conference, with one statement from Johnson, it was over. He paced the Oval Office, his hands clenching and unclenching, his mind racing with how to reclaim the momentum, how to turn this failure into a rallying cry rather than a retreat. The betrayal stung. Johnson, the man he had backed for Speaker, had caved to pressure, proving himself no better than the spineless Republicans before him. Bondi, whom he had trusted to lead the charge, had lost her nerve. The narrative had slipped from his control, and that infuriated him more than anything. The media, which had been on the ropes just days before, had seized the moment, twisting the collapse of impeachment into yet another tale of Trump's impulsiveness, of his inability to see the long game, of his tendency to overreach in his relentless war against the establishment. And yet, despite the chaos, despite the loss, Trump was not beaten. He had seen the tides of public opinion shift before, had been declared finished, only to rise again, stronger, more resilient, more determined. The American people, weary of the constant chaos and division, were losing patience. But he knew something Washington didn't. He knew that his people, the forgotten men and women who had rallied behind him since the beginning, still believed in him. He had given them something no other politician had: genuine, unflinching, unbreakable loyalty. And now he would remind them of that once again. In the end, the impeachment attempt failed spectacularly. Boasberg remained on the bench, his reputation tarnished, but his integrity intact, the deep state rejoicing in their survival, the bureaucrats sneering at Trump's misstep, convinced that they had weathered his storm once and for all. But they were wrong. Trump, bruised but unbowed, vowed to continue his fight for the soul of the nation. He did what he always did. He took to the airwaves, to Truth Social, to rallies where his words carried the force of a movement that would not be silenced. He reframed the battle, turning defeat into yet another chapter in his war against the entrenched elites, another sign that the system was rigged against him and, by extension, against the American people. He spoke directly to them, to the truck drivers and factory workers, to the small business owners and middle-class families struggling under the weight of Washington's failures. He reminded them that he never gave up on them, that he never surrendered, that no matter how many times the swamp tried to beat him down, he kept fighting, and they loved him for it. Because Trump understood something his enemies never would. It wasn't about winning every battle, it was about never stopping the war.